Welcome, everybody, to the European Gas Market Outlook 2026, the Europe part of the forum here. I'm delighted to be joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Anne-Sophie, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to be focusing on the European gas market and talking about that in the context of Russia, Ukraine, and other dynamics which may be influencing that in the year ahead.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Well, great to see you. I'd like to start with a sort of assumption, however unlikely we might believe it to be, which is that we will see an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That doesn't look likely at all in the immediate sense. But let's just make that assumption as economists, even not just as politicians, and say that we have a peace deal that will come about this year. Would that have any practical impact on Europe's gas intake, where it's taking its gas from, or have we settled in to a pattern that you think would be irreversible?
It's a very good question. I think we are very simply too far gone. There have been the invasion of Ukraine, the constant attacks, but also Russia has basically been testing the European defense with planes and drones. So the trust is really broken. Also, it's important to remember that Europe last year imported about 35 BCM of Russian gas, 20 BCM of LNG, 15 BCM roughly of pipeline gas, which is also going to some non-EU countries such as Serbia. So the current plan of Europe to phase out Russian gas will be in different steps, with the most important ones being at the end of this year, Russian LNG stops, and then Russian pipeline gas stops on the 30th of September 2027. So if there was a peace agreement, I think the most important impact would be potentially on Russian pipeline gas, which would remain. But that would be in 2027, not really in 2026. I mean, the volumes which are going to be impacted in 2026 about the sanctions, about the phase-out deal, are really small, especially for pipeline gas.
Okay, so not a lot of change this year regardless, but we'll see those changes come into effect anyway, as planned in 2027. What about prices? I mean, we saw LNG, supported quite well by Europe last year in terms of global LNG prices. Demand was, relatively robust versus Asia, which was relatively speaking muted for that region. But again, what would a Russia-Ukraine deal do to gas prices, would you say? I mean, presumably they would head lower. But where are the dynamics, do you think, on that front?
What is very interesting is that since the beginning of the winter in Europe, we've actually seen prices dropping. I mean, it's remarkable that we are below 30 euro per megawatt hour, even though storage is quite low. I mean, we are right now about 10% lower than last year. And I'm looking at the window because it's snowing in Paris, which is quite exceptional. So I am more worried about the weather, which is actually coming from Russia, than about Russian pipeline gas right now. But there is one important thing that we should not forget about a potential peace agreement. This is that if the US is involved, and if there is a global peace agreement, then maybe some sanctions on Russian LNG would be removed. And that could bring back the smaller LNG plants which have been sanctioned by the Biden administration, so Portovaya and Vitsopt, and also facilitate Arctic LNG 2, because the plant is sanctioned. It's right now smuggling some LNG to China, but officially it's sanctioned, and they have not had access to the ARC7 LNG cargoes, which are very essential for the good operation. So that is something, the logistic part is something that people should be looking at. Should there be a potential peace agreement? But as I said, I mean, for Europe, right now, the main question is about how cold the weather is going to be, and how strong our demand is going to be, and how strong the storage refilling needs are going to be in April. This is a big question.
Okay, absolutely. And of course, we saw Europe have to compete with China. I remember when the gas prices exploded post Russia-Ukraine initially, and Europe was really caught, wasn't it? I mean, Asia did even worse, but they were all exposed very much to the spike in prices. Everything then settled down. Of course, what then materialized was more American LNG being taken into Europe. That has only increased, and of course, the agenda of the US is with its energy dominance agenda is to maximize those LNG exports even more into Europe and anywhere else which will take them. How vulnerable do you think Europe has become to that dependency? It was dependent on Russian LNG and gas more before the Ukraine war, but it's replaced that with dependency on the US. Would you agree? And
Yes, I mean,
given
to a certain
given
extent,
geopolitics, that's a tricky situation, isn't it?
it's an interesting situation. I mean, it's true that last year, EU LNG imports have been at a record level, 145 BCM. I mean, we were at roughly 80 BCM in 2021. So you can see we have almost doubled. And US LNG was a bit more than 50% of that. It was 80 BCM. So it's an increased dependency. We are not at a level where US LNG has completely replaced Russian pipeline gas and Russian gas in general, but we have increased our dependency. Now, it makes us indeed more vulnerable to whatever is happening on global LNG market. I mean, should something happen in Asia, there will
Yeah,
be competition for LNG. But where this is interesting is that both last year and in 2022, the role of China was actually very important because LNG imports dropped in China.
yeah,
And this has actually helped Europe quite substantially in both years. I think if we were not in such a situation, both in 2022 and in 2025, the prices would be at a completely different levels. Now, I mean, the Chinese LNG imports have dropped last year. I think they are
yeah.
bound to rebound this year.
Mm.
And especially because prices are moving down, then of course, Asian LNG demand is expected to rebound as well. So what most analysts expect is that most of the additional LNG which is coming to the market in 2026, mostly from the US, a little bit from Qatar, depending on when the North Field expansion starts, is going to go to Asia rather than Europe.
Okay, and so where does that leave Europe though? That's I know you're saying it has a cold winter. It has enough storage, do you think, to sort of, I suppose, fight any shortage that may appear out of that? As you said, Asia's going to rebound. It's been a bit quiet the last year or two. Um, what vulnerability does that leave Europe in?
Think the most important vulnerability would be if we have a cold spell,
Yeah.
say in March, because this is when, yeah, storage would be at much lower levels, of course, but this is also where you have a much lower withdrawal rate because storage levels are at such low levels. And this is a potential issue that we may face. And again, I mean, it's all about weather at the end of the day. And this, if this is coupled with, Dunkelflaute that has plagued us a little bit last winter, then this is even worse. So we would need to attract even more LNG in that case. And that can also lead to a spike in terms of prices, as we have seen, for example, in March 2018.
Okay, I mean, and, the LNG market has been relatively, I suppose, tight ish and expected to be this year on the whole in terms of supply versus demand. But we do have a wave of new supply coming on, don't we, at the end of this year and into 27, 28. Again, we don't know where demand is going to go, but could we see a glut? Could we see an oversupplied market, do you think? How do consumers and producers look at that market as we stand at the beginning of 26?
It's an excellent question that nobody is actually managing to answer. There are two narratives. The first one is that because we are facing right now a very tight market, we don't know actually what an unconstrained LNG demand is looking like. So it might very well be that all these volumes are going to be sucked in by Asia, by Europe, etc. And in the end, okay, we have lower prices, but the volumes are actually absorbed. The other one is that there is so much LNG which is coming that there is no way the market is going to absorb that. And the rhetoric that can actually move or displace coal-fired generation in Asia is actually wrong because the prices are never going to be low enough to displace existing coal-fired generation. So we are between
Mm.
those two narratives right now. And of course, it's impacted a lot by the geopolitics. because, well, Europe is going to stop importing Russian gas and Russian pipeline gas and Russian LNG. China has stopped importing US LNG. So it's all complicated.
Absolutely. What about, I mean, let's talk about sort of as again with that sort of new LNG supply that's coming on board and traditional, so the strongest players in the market. You've got Qatar versus US at the moment, who seem to be sort of competing on that front. You've obviously got Canada as well, but you know, Qatar, US, the two biggest sort of LNG suppliers. Again, I mean, bearing in mind that we have a lot of these new projects that are reaching FID, etc. Qatar was always so dominant, wasn't it? Had a very comfortable position. It also has its challenges now with the LNG supply into Europe, with the emissions question marks that are putting sort of being put on that by Europe. That's obviously still being negotiated. But I mean, can those two still have an equal place in the future market of LNG?
Well,
We
I have to
saw a
say
lot of
that Qatar,
Australian LNG close down, for example, a few years ago.
the strategy of Qatar is, one of the big question marks for me because, I mean, we have seen that the existing expansion that is happening this year has been actually postponed. It was supposed to start a little bit earlier. Uh, I, 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 I I can see different scenarios. I mean, either the Qataris are not happy because they have not signed enough long-term contracts, because they are very inflexible in terms of the delivery terms. They want DES terms, not FOB. So maybe, they are going to actually slow down the expansion, or maybe they are going to actually take an active role, either by actively marketing their LNG to especially the Asian market and trying to help in terms of
Mm,
managing the infrastructure, developing LNG import terminals, pipeline, gas-fired plants, or they will try to undercut US LNG. And let's not forget that if there is one last man standing in the gas and LNG world, this is Qatar, because they are by far the lowest gas producer.
absolutely. And of course, they have, less per capita cost, let's say. So they're in a very advantageous position. Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar Center on Global Energy Policy. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Global Energy Outlook Forum. It's been great to have your insights.
Thank you so much for inviting me again.
All the best.